The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of stillness that hinted at a storm just beneath the surface. The judge's gavel slammed down with an unsettling finality, the noise echoing in the chamber like the last heartbeat of a dying man. Judge Timothy Richards, a man known for his arrogance and harsh judgment, sat at the bench with his face set in a permanent scowl. His eyes, cold and calculating, flicked over the defendant in front of him, a black man who stood motionless, his hands folded neatly before him. His name was Jonathan Green, and though he was as composed as anyone could be, the tension in the room hung heavy. "Defendant," the judge's voice rang out, sharp and cutting, "you've been charged with a traffic violation. Pay your fine immediately or face imprisonment." Jonathan kept his eyes on the judge, not daring to look away, even as Richard's voice seemed to grow more venomous with each word. "You're not above the law, Mr. Green," Judge Richards sneered, his gaze narrowing. The words stung with an undercurrent of contempt. It wasn't just about the ticket. Jonathan could feel it in his bones. It was something else, something much darker. The audience in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Some tried to look away, others pretended to be engrossed in the paperwork in front of them. But it was clear that the judge had crossed a line. The atmosphere was tense with unspoken thoughts. Was it just a traffic violation that had gotten the judge riled up? Or was it something more? Jonathan stood firm. He had been in enough courtrooms to know how this went. The system was supposed to be blind, impartial. But not today. Not with this judge. He could feel the weight of history bearing down on him, the ghosts of injustices past watching from the shadows. He took a breath before responding, his voice calm but steady. "I'm asking for leniency, Your Honor. I'm not a criminal." The judge's lips curled into a mock smile, though there was nothing remotely amusing in his expression. "Leniency?" Richards barked. "Do you think you're special? Just another entitled man who thinks the law doesn't apply to him? We all know your type, Mr. Green." Jonathan held his tongue, fighting the urge to snap back. He had seen this before, judges who thought their robes gave them the right to belittle others, to paint everyone who didn't fit their narrow view of the world with the same broad brush. But this was different. This wasn't just a traffic case. This was about power, about control. Richards continued, barely glancing at the paperwork in front of him, as if the decision had already been made in his mind. "Pay your fine immediately," he demanded again. His tone was condescending, as though Jonathan had no choice but to comply. The courtroom fell silent. Jonathan could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The prosecutor, sitting with her arms crossed, didn't seem to bat an eyelash. The bailiff stood motionless at the back. No one seemed ready to challenge the judge, not even for a moment. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He wasn't just being punished for his traffic violation. He was being punished for who he was, for something the judge couldn't even be bothered to hide. With his jaw set, Jonathan said nothing further, accepting the unjust decision without protest. As the court proceedings continued, Richards delivered his final words. "You'll regret this, Mr. Green," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jonathan to hear. Was it a threat, promise, or just the bitter words of a man who reveled in his own power? Jonathan wasn't sure. All he knew was that this encounter, this petty humiliation, wasn't the end of the story. Couldn't be. When the hearing adjourned and Jonathan stood to leave, the weight of what had just happened clung to him. The injustice, the inequality, it felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. And somewhere deep down, A part of him knew this wouldn't be the last time he would cross paths with Judge Richards. As he walked out of the courtroom, the echoes of the judge's voice haunted him. But even in the face of all that animosity, Jonathan felt something else stir within him. A quiet, simmering resolve. This wasn't just a fight over a fine. It was a fight over something much bigger. And he wouldn't back down. The questions gnawed at him as he stepped into the empty hallway. What had driven Richards to this point? Was it just arrogance? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? And most importantly, would Jonathan find a way to make sure that this moment wouldn't fade into the countless others where justice was denied? It was only the beginning. Weeks had passed since Jonathan Green's encounter with Judge Richards, but the injustice of that day lingered in his mind like a shadow that refused to fade. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the judge's sneering voice, the way it dripped with disdain. It wasn't just the fine that stung. It was the way Richards had looked at him, as if he were beneath the law, as if he were nothing more than a stereotype, a criminal in the making. Jonathan tried to push it from his mind. He had work to do, but the more he tried to focus on the cases on his desk, the more his thoughts kept returning to the courtroom, to that moment when Richards had thrown him aside. There was something about it, something personal in the way the judge had treated him, something Jonathan couldn't let go. Then, one morning, an unexpected letter arrived. It wasn't like the usual correspondence from the U.S. Attorney's Office, where the writing was formal and mechanical. This one was marked with an urgent stamp, the kind that made Jonathan's heart race with a strange mixture of curiosity and dread. He tore it open quickly. Mr. Green, you are needed at the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. for a case involving the U.S. versus Judge Timothy Richards. Immediate action is required. Please report at once. The name struck Jonathan like a lightning bolt. Judge Timothy Richards. The same man who had humiliated him in the courtroom only a few weeks ago. At first, Jonathan thought it was a mistake. But the more he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't a coincidence. The judge he had crossed paths with had found himself under federal investigation, and Jonathan was being called to participate. As he packed his things and made the long drive to Washington, a strange knot twisted in his stomach. What was going on? Why had this case, of all things, landed on his desk? And what did this mean for him? When Jonathan arrived at the courthouse, he was escorted through the cold marble halls by a security officer who didn't say much. The courthouse felt different. Larger, more intimidating, its walls filled with history and power. As he walked into the courtroom, his eyes immediately fell on the bench where Judge Richards sat, looking far too comfortable in his usual place of authority. But there was something different this time. Judge Richards wasn't presiding over the case. Instead, he was on the other side of the law, sitting quietly, his expression a mix of arrogance and fear. And the prosecutor standing before him wasn't some faceless figure. It was Jonathan Green. For a brief moment, Jonathan thought he had misheard. But as the case files were handed to him and he took his seat at the prosecutor's table, it all came rushing back. Richards, the man who had once condemned him, was now the defendant. Jonathan's mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of twisted karmic turn? Was he meant to be here, facing the very man who had tried to break him? Judge Richards glanced over at Jonathan, his eyes narrowing in recognition. The flicker of discomfort that crossed his face was brief, but it didn't go unnoticed. Jonathan's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about the judge's career. It was about the truth, and Jonathan knew that truth was something Richards had spent years hiding. As the trial began, Jonathan found himself navigating a delicate balance. He was still reeling from the humiliation he'd faced in Richard's courtroom, but now he was no longer just the defendant. He was the one with the power. His job was to prosecute, to expose the corruption and prejudice that had been festering in Richard's decisions for years. And from the moment he began presenting the case, Jonathan could see the cracks in the judge's facade. Richards was being accused of a range of serious offenses: bribery, corruption, and racial bias. But as Jonathan laid out the facts, the judge seemed less concerned with defending himself than with protecting his reputation. His smugness hadn't disappeared. It had only been masked by an air of barely contained panic. And with every piece of evidence Jonathan presented, it became clearer that Richards wasn't just a biased judge. He was something much worse. Jonathan's thoughts turned inward. How had this man, this judge, risen so high in the ranks? Was it pure ambition, or was there something darker at play? The more he looked at Richards, the more it seemed like the judge had built his career on the backs of people like Jonathan, those who could be crushed under the weight of his authority. And what troubled Jonathan even more was the realization that, for all his legal knowledge, he couldn't find a way to make Richards fully accountable. The system had allowed him to rise, and now it seemed to be bending over backward to protect him. Jonathan pushed aside his doubts. He had a job to do. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. But deep down, there was something gnawing at him, something telling him that this case, this investigation, was far from simple. The more he dug into Richard's past, the more Jonathan realized that the judge had been involved in far more than simple judicial corruption. There were whispers, rumors about money laundering, ties to organized crime, and shady deals that went back years. And just when Jonathan thought he had a handle on the situation, a new piece of evidence surfaced, one that completely shifted the direction of the case. It wasn't just that Richards was a racist or a corrupt judge. He had been using his position to manipulate the law for his own gain, with connections far deeper than anyone had suspected. Jonathan's stomach tightened as he read through the new evidence, knowing that exposing Richards for who he truly was could be the key to ending his reign of power. But the question still lingered. Was this just about justice, or was there something more at stake here? And could Jonathan really separate his personal feelings from the cold, hard facts? The case had only just begun, and already it was spiraling in ways Jonathan hadn't anticipated. One thing was clear: the fight for justice wouldn't be as simple as he had hoped. And the deeper he got into this case, the more it seemed like he was walking a dangerous line, one where the consequences were as unpredictable as the man on trial. The courtroom felt different now, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on everyone present. Jonathan sat at the prosecutor's table, the weight of the case pressing down on him with each passing minute. He had known this moment would come, the point where the scales would tip, where the evidence would finally expose the corruption and malice lurking beneath Judge Richards' polished exterior. But now that it was here, he felt an uneasy sense of foreboding. Nothing about this felt as simple as it should have. Judge Richards was no longer the man in control. His once confident demeanor was now a mask, cracked and slipping with each word Jonathan spoke. It was as if the trial was slowly pulling away the layers of the judge's carefully constructed identity, revealing the man who had used his power to trample over others for years. But the deeper Jonathan dug, the more unsettling it became. Richards wasn't just a racist judge with a vendetta against people like Jonathan. He was something far worse. The investigation had taken a sharp turn when Jonathan discovered that Richards had been involved in illegal activities far beyond simple bribery or bias. The judge had been laundering money through court cases, taking bribes in exchange for favorable rulings, and working with organized crime syndicates to cover his tracks. His connections went deep, stretching into the shadows of the legal system, beyond even the reach of most federal agents. The more Jonathan uncovered, the more tangled the web seemed to become. But Jonathan wasn't the only one who had uncovered these secrets. As the trial progressed, the defense team scrambled to cover up the judge's ties to the criminal underworld, spinning a web of lies that only made the situation more volatile. They tried to discredit Jonathan at every turn, suggesting that his motivations were personal, that he was simply seeking revenge for the humiliation he had suffered at Richard's hands. But Jonathan knew better. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here because the truth needed to be brought to light. The case reached a boiling point when Jonathan revealed a damning piece of evidence: secret recordings of Judge Richards speaking to known criminals, discussing illegal deals that had been brokered in his chambers. The room fell silent as the audio played through the courtroom speakers, Richard's voice unmistakable, filled with greed and calculated malice. The judge's face turned pale as the recordings laid bare his true nature. For a brief moment, Jonathan almost felt sorry for the man. Almost. But pity didn't belong in this courtroom. Richards had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. Jonathan could see the panic in the judge's eyes, the realization that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling. He had underestimated Jonathan, that much was clear. He had assumed that the law and his position in it would protect him from the consequences of his actions. But Jonathan wasn't about to let him escape. Not this time. As the trial reached its climax, the final moments seemed to stretch on forever. Richards was no longer the judge. He was the defendant, standing before the very system he had corrupted. The courtroom, once filled with the silent awe of his power, now buzzed with anticipation. The final verdict was near. The weight of every word Jonathan had spoken, every piece of evidence he had presented, hung in the air, pressing down on Richards like a vice. Jonathan stood, facing the judge for the final time. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady as he spoke. Judge Timothy Richards, you have abused your power. You have taken advantage of your position to harm those who trusted you, and you have destroyed the very system you swore to uphold. Today the truth comes out. Today justice will be served. Richards, once a man of authority and pride, looked down, his hands shaking slightly. He was no longer the towering figure who had once stood in judgment over others. Now he was just a man facing the consequences of his own actions. The judge's world, built on lies and corruption, was crumbling before him, and he could do nothing to stop it. But just as Jonathan thought he had won, just as he believed the case had come to an end, a new revelation hit like a thunderclap. The defense had one last trick up their sleeve. A final twist. They revealed that Richards had connections far beyond what Jonathan had uncovered. A powerful network of allies in high places, including members of the government itself. The case, it seemed, was even more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Whispers filled the air as the defense suggested that the trial had been manipulated, that Jonathan's personal history with the judge had clouded his judgment. The accusations hung in the air like smoke. Could Richards still escape? Could he use his connections to silence the truth? Jonathan's mind raced as the uncertainty crept in. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something clicked. This wasn't just about bringing Richards down. It was about exposing the system that had allowed him to operate for so long, about showing the world that power could no longer shield corrupt men from justice. Jonathan took a deep breath and stepped forward. He wasn't going to let the system protect him anymore. He had come too far. With unwavering resolve, Jonathan made his final statement. No amount of power, no network of influence, can undo the truth. You will face the consequences of your actions, and the world will see you for what you truly are. This isn't about me. It's about all the people you've wronged. It's about justice. The gavel came down with a final, resounding thud. Judge Richards was convicted on all charges. His empire of corruption shattered in an instant. But as the courtroom erupted in applause, Jonathan didn't feel the rush of victory he had imagined. There was no celebration, no satisfaction. The battle had been won, but the war against the system, against the prejudice, against the corruption was far from over. As Richards was led away in handcuffs, Jonathan stood still, his thoughts racing. This wasn't the end. Couldn't be. The fight for justice had only just begun, and there was much more to uncover. But one thing was certain. Jonathan would keep fighting, no matter what it cost him. In the silence of the courtroom, Jonathan reflected on what he had learned. Justice wasn't easy, and it didn't come without sacrifice. But if he could bring down a man like Judge Richards, maybe there was still hope for a system that had seemed so broken. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for true justice to prevail.